today's video, I want to talk about my personal top 5 books that feature dragons. Because in the recent times I've been getting more and more back into fantasy reading and I want to actually read more books with dragons, but I thought it would already be a good idea to make this list right now with the current books that I've read before I get into more of them. And I actually had plans and had already recorded this video last week, and it was before I read the book Fourth Wing, because I wanted to really dramatically be like 5 books with dragons that are not Fourth Wing. But yeah, in the meantime, I have read Fourth Wing. It took a marvelous only 3 days. It was that good. So if you want to find out on what place Fourth Wing is in my list, because of course it is in it, then of course feel free to stick around. Before I get into my actual top 5, I want to give 2 honorable mentions. The first honorable mention is A Song of Fire and Ice by J.R.R. Martin, who everyone knows from the TV series Game of Thrones. I actually started reading the first book and I think also the second book way time ago, before the series actually aired on TV. And then the series aired, so I watched the series. And I haven't actually read the books again or reread them because I think I finished the first one. I remember that at the time that I read them, I was feeling very overwhelmed and it was just a little bit too much. So that's one of the reasons that this book is kind of on this list, but kind of not on this list, because I don't remember how good the book was in comparison to the series. And in the meantime, I have just watched the series and I really did enjoy that. I hear from a lot of people that the books are better. Some people say the series is better. I don't know. I would have to reread them, but I know it's a very good book series that of course has a lot of dragons. And the second honorable mention is thanks to my partner. My partner also reads fantasy, and whenever he knew I was preparing this video, I was like, oh my god, you have to include Margaret Weis's Dragonlance, and the first book is called Mistress of Dragons, or in Dutch Drakenvrouwen, and he really loves that series. He's like, you have to read it, but the thing is, I prefer reading in English and he has a lot of books in Dutch, and in Dutch, which is my native language, I just can't. So I prefer reading in English, and I am probably going to read them in English somewhere in the future, but I don't know when yet. But he was like, you have to include this in your video. And of course, I will include all of the books in the description box of this video. Don't go watch it before you actually saw the video, because then you will get spoilers of which ones are in my top 5. So now let's get into the actual top 5. And at the lowest spot 5, is Eragon by Christopher Paolini. It's actually the first book of the Inheritance cycle, which apparently is very good. I have only read, I think, the first book. Keep in mind, I was, I think, somewhere between 13 and 15 whenever I read this book, and the writer of this book was 17 when he wrote the first book, which is something that I didn't know at the time. And the thing is, when you read this book, of course the movie has come out in the meantime as well, I felt the movie very underwhelming. In the first book of Eragon, we find out that there is a world that is a setting where magic is still available, and there are like a few dragons, but dragons are also like extinct, kind of, or more or less extinct. And the main character ends up finding a blue gemstone that turns out to be a dragon egg. He hatches it, and then the dragon actually teaches him how to be a dragon rider, and it's like very much a good versus evil type of tale. But I did really enjoy the book, and the series only gets better if you read the other books. Apparently, I haven't read them, that's why I just say Eragon and not the full Inheritance cycle. But I personally remember that I really loved this book, and I was just like, ooh, dragons, for a long time after that. The next book, spot number 4 on my list, is The Hobbit by Tolkien. If you don't know what The Hobbit is about, it's basically a tale following Bilbo Baggins, a hobbit from the Shire, who goes on an adventure thanks to his friend the wizard Gandalf, and he joins in on a group of dwarves to help them steal something to regain their rightful place in this world, the place that they were actually born and raised and stuff, but a dragon actually took it over. So in this book we really follow this journey and how he gets back, etc. The book isn't as thick as one of the Lord of the Rings books, and it was, I remember vividly, it was one of the first like epic fantasy books that I read whenever I went into like the secondary school rate, so I was 12 when I read this book, and it had a huge impact on me. I read The Hobbit before I read the other Lord of the Rings trilogy, and I remember that my dad was like, you're reading this, because he was like, this is adult fantasy already. But yeah, it was available in my school library, and it's one of my favorite books. I will always, if I'm like in a reading slump, there's a few books I gravitate towards to get out of it. The Hobbit is one of them. So if you haven't read the book yet, it's way better than the movies that they make. I don't get why they made it into a 3-part movie, but that's a whole other story that we're not gonna have today. On spot number 3 in my top 5 is the Farseer trilogy by Robin Hobb. In the Farseer trilogy, which is really a story in which you follow a character growing from very young to then more or less adults. I don't ever feel like the main character, who's called Fitz, actually fully grows up, but yeah, that's up to debate. In the first book, you really follow Fitz from age 6 to I think about 12, 13, 14 maybe. So he's really like growing up in this first part. The second book then continues on. I feel the second book I had a lot of struggles getting through it, because the first book was really like fast paced and everything was happening and scene setting. In the second book, it feels like you're obviously like going somewhere, but it wasn't as easy for me to read as the first book. And then the third book, in the conclusion kind of the series. Now, of course, Robin Hobb being Robin Hobb, she has other trilogies that follow this one. You actually get to the climax of the book and you actually encounter the dragons, which are called the Elderlings in this trilogy. And I was really pleasantly surprised by it. Let's just keep it at that. I'm not gonna give too much spoilers, but I personally really enjoyed it. On spot number 2 is Fourth Wing by Rebecca Yaros. Why haven't I put this on the number 1 spot? Well, because I feel like there is still a lot that can happen after the first book. Now, I went into this book without actually researching a lot about the contents of this book, so I knew that it was like a school with dragons and that our main character has to get into this school and become a dragon rider. So the main character's name is Violet, and Violet is actually the daughter of the headmistress of this school, as you discover in the first chapter. And she wants to be a scribe, but her mother like forces her, pushes her, obliges her to become a dragon rider. So she goes through all of these tests and she has to do like a lot of things to prove herself, because, well, she's been working to become a scribe and not to become a dragon rider per se. So we follow this main character, Violet. I personally loved this book. I read it only a few days ago, so it's still very fresh in my mind. I was really impressed by this book. I did not see where it was going at all in the last few chapters, and now I'm so excited for the next part to come out next year. There's a lot of really big plot twists in this book that I did not see coming until the very end of the book, and I am probably going to reread it, knowing now what I know happens at the end, to see if I can find the little indicators that are towards the book, because apparently there are a few that I might have just completely missed, completely went over my head. This is definitely an adult fantasy book, because there is a little bit of like romance involved, and it's described very well. Let's just keep it at that. And then, of course, on spot number 1 is Priory of the Orange Tree by Samantha Shannon. There is already a second book, which is called Day of Fallen Night. I haven't fully read it yet, so I'm not including this in my top 5. You follow 2 main character lines or storylines. So in the first plot line, we follow one girl who is the assistant to Queen Sabran of a very powerful house, of the person who years and generations ago actually slayed the dragons that were like very bad and actually imprisoned them somehow. I'm not gonna tell you too much about it. And the main purpose of this queen line is that they all have daughters, and every time that there is a new daughter born, the protection actually stays. So we follow on one side Eid, who is like one of the assistants to this queen, and then in the second storyline we actually follow Tani, who's a girl who is going to be a dragon rider. So dragons are widely available in this world under different forms and shapes, and there are actually like not really apprenticeships, but like more of like a competition, but you have to like be trained to be a dragon rider, and we follow her as she goes through this process. So the 2 storylines are like they go from one to the other, and then you have some other things mixed in as well, which makes it a very nice read because you're not always following the same person. But in the book The Priory of the Orange Tree, in the end, all of the plot lines kind of come together and merge together, and you will still get the perspective of the one and of the other, but they come to a common goal. I personally loved this book. It's a big chunk of a book, but trust me, it is well worth it. I cannot wait to continue reading in a day of Fallen Night. So this is my personal top 5 of dragon books that I have recently read, or that I have read in the past, that I really think have made a big difference for me in my reading. And I would of course love to know from you which are your favorite books with dragons in them, because I'm currently doing a little bit more research and I want to make this list even bigger, like have more dragon books and actually talk about them, because that's one of the things in fantasy. You either have like fae and fairies, you have vampires, you also have dragons, and I would love to have like more books on each of those. I want to thank you again so much for watching. Happy reading, and I will see you very soon with a new video. Bye!